Email report. There we go. Okay, so we didn't get to the questions last time, so we're going to do them now. All right, so what type of connective tissue is this? Oh, we have some disagreement in this one. This means it's a good question. All right, so we look at this picture, and first, how do we know it's a connective tissue? And I know that's not part of the question, but remember that a connective tissue, when you look at a connective tissue, most of what you're going to see is not cells. So when we look at this, we've got a few cells here, or at least the nuclei here. So here's a cell, there's another, and another, and another. But most of the frame here is taken up by other stuff. And that's a classic look of a connective tissue. Unlike an epithelium or a muscle tissue where you see nothing but cells, in connective tissue, there's much more stuff there than just cells. All right. So then we have to make our classification. Is it loose or dense, regular or irregular? So first one, loose or dense. Well, we can see these big spaces here, in white. In a dense connective tissue, everything is sort of packed together. And in this picture, we're not really seeing that. We're seeing sort of a looseness and space in between. So this would be a loose connective tissue. Then we have to decide regular or irregular. And what those two words mean is there a pattern or is it kind of all jumbled up? In a regular connective tissue, all of the, there's an easy to see pattern, a uniformity, either parallel fibers or things that are all lined up next to each other. And in this case, this looks like somebody just kind of threw it on the table in a big mess. So this would be a loose, irregular connective tissue. And this is an example of areolar tissue, which is one of the most common kinds of connective tissue in the body. Most of what we see here are fibers that give this tissue both stretchiness or elasticity as well as strength, so you have collagen and elastic fibers there. So areolar tissue, which is an example of a loose, irregular tissue. All right. So what kind of connective tissue is this one? Got to send you a new question, so hold on. There we go.
I'm literally just trying to make sure that all of my arguments select process not changing my position every time.
All right, very good. All right, I'm going to close it because I think that's everybody. All right, so this one is dense, regular. All right, so when you look at this, it looks like it's all packed together. It looks like it's packed, and we have a lot of parallel lines here. So this would be a dense, regular connective tissue. This would probably be a tendon or a ligament, which are made up of fibers that run in parallel and connect muscles to bones or bones to bones. All right, one more. What type is this one? All right, jump in there. 8 seconds left. All right, so first we look at this and, is it dense or is it loose? So remember that first slide we looked at, the first picture, that areolar tissue? Kind of keep that in your mind. That's a loose connective tissue. So compared to that one, does this one have more, is it more packed together or less packed together? Well, it's more packed together. So this would be a dense connective tissue. Now, some of you will say, but wait a minute, there's all these spaces in here. True, but mostly things are packed together. There's not a lot of space compared to the amount of stuff that's there. You compare that to that one, and here, there's more space than stuff, really, because we have all these spaces in between and these few little wispy fibers. So this is looking pretty packed together. So that's dense. And then regular or irregular, well, there's not much of a pattern there. We're not seeing parallel lines, certainly. So this would be a dense, irregular connective tissue. And this would be dermis, for example, which we're going to talk about, I hope, later today or otherwise Monday, which is the rubbery layer of skin. All right. Okay. Oh, one more. I thought that was it, but here's another one. What type of tissue is this? And come on, let me send it to you. There we go. And next week and the week after in lab, you're going to have ample opportunity to look at these different tissues so that you'll be able to name them on site, because that's our first lab exam is, here's a slide, tell me what kind of tissue it is. All right, 10 seconds. Oh, that's all the students in the room. Okay, so this is adipose tissue. Classic pattern recognition. You see under the microscope, when we look at adipose tissue, all we see is the skeleton of the cell, so to speak, because the fat that would normally occupy these empty spaces, it gets removed when the tissue is processed for a light microscopy. So we end up with these little cavities here, and this is adipose tissue. All right. One of the least popular tissues in the body. All right. So connective tissue, there's connective tissue proper, there's the fluid connective tissues, and then there's the structural ones. So the fluid connective tissues, there's only two. There's blood and there's lymph. Blood you're familiar with. Lymph you probably aren't very familiar with, but we'll talk about it just briefly here in a minute. So why do we consider blood a connective tissue? Well, the reason is it fits all of the requirements or standards of a connective tissue. In other words, remember, a connective tissue is mostly non-cellular. Blood is mostly non-cellular. The blood cells only make up about 35 to 45% of the total blood volume. The rest is non-cellular components, which is what we call the plasma. So we have specialized cells in the blood. We have extracellular proteins, which we find in all connective tissues. This is the non-cellular component of blood, has lots of protein dissolved in it. The ground substance is the fluid itself that makes up the blood. So altogether, the matrix of blood, remember the matrix is the extracellular proteins plus the ground substance, we call that plasma. Plasma is the non-cellular component of blood. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about blood in this semester, but at the start of the second semester, you're going to learn a lot about blood. But the components of blood, we have the red blood cells, we have the platelets, and then we have the family of white blood cells, each of which has a slightly different function. All right. The lymph is the second fluid connective tissue. And the easiest way to describe what it is to follow some fluid around the body. Okay, so we know that the heart pumps blood out to the tissues. In the capillary bed here, blood passes through this capillary bed and then heads back to the heart. not all of the fluid that enters the capillary bed exits the capillary bed in the vein. And the reason for that is some water is actually pushed out of the vasculature or out of the capillary bed and ends up outside of the vessel system surrounding the cells. Well, if this is happening all around the body all the time, at some point there would be no blood left because all the fluid would be out here in the tissues. So the lymphatic system drains that extra fluid that leaves the vessels, and it drains it back into the venous system. So lymph is sort of a secondary vessel system, but instead of a loop, from heart to artery to capillary bed to vein and back, it's a one-directional thing. So the lymphatics start out in the tissues and they drain in towards the bloodstream. And lymph is also a fluid connective tissue. There are very few cells that are present there, but there's a lot of protein, a lot of water, and a lot of other substances. Yeah?
That's a question, but is lymph and the lymph nodes then part of the circulatory system?
It's not technically. We consider it the lymphatic system. It's a separate organ system, but it does intersect with the circulatory system. Good question. And lymph nodes, which I know you've all heard of, they filter the lymph that's draining back towards the vessels, and they try to take everything that doesn't belong out of it, so we don't end up with bacteria entering our bloodstream. The lymph nodes filter that out before that occurs. But you'll learn all about the lymphatic system again next semester. All right, so 2 fluid connective tissues. And then the rest of the connective tissues are the supporting tissues. So cartilage, there's 3 main types. There's hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrous cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is very plastic-like. So like some of the connections of your ribs to the sternum in the center of your chest are hyaline cartilage. So if you can imagine a dense plastic, that's sort of what hyaline cartilage is like. Under the microscope, we see this kind of smooth plastic or glass-looking substance surrounding cells that are in these little containers or little spaces that we call lacunae. So we have matrix and we have cells. Elastic cartilage bounces back to its original shape. So, like the classic example is the pinna or the part of your ear that sticks out. That's elastic cartilage. The septum between the nostrils is also, if you move your nose, it snaps back to its original shape. Well, that's what elastic cartilage does. And here, we see some of this same glassiness, but there's a lot of fibers present, and it's because it's those fibers that give elastic cartilage its elasticity, in other words, snapping back to its original shape. And then fibrous cartilage, there's not an example that we can see from the outside, but like the discs that sit between your vertebrae, those are an example of fibrous cartilage. So again, we have cartilage cells called chondrocytes in these little gaps called lacunae, but here we have a lot of fibers, and these are collagen fibers, and they tend to run all in the same direction. So just like connective tissue proper, we can classify these using the same words. So like hyaline cartilage is a dense, irregular. Elastic is a loose, irregular because it's not as tightly packed. And then fibrous cartilage is a dense, regular. But in lab, what we're going to be learning is how to identify the actual tissue type. So like that this is hyaline, this is elastic, and this is fibrous cartilage. All right. The last structural connective tissue is bone. We're going to talk at great length about bone, not next chapter, but the chapter after that, when we talk about osseous tissue. But just as an introduction, there's 2 arrangements or organizations of bone. There's spongy bone and there's compact bone. So in spongy bone, it looks a little bit like a sea sponge, which now spongy, it doesn't mean that it's soft or flexible. It's all about the appearance, So we have this kind of complicated network of interlocking, well, they're called trabeculi, but joints and struts here that make up spongy bone. And then in compact bone, we have these tight circles of very dense, very compact bone. So we'll talk more about those into chapter 6. All right. So from the connective tissues and the epithelium, we have 4 membranes that are 4 kinds of membranes that are present in the body. And just like the cell membrane is hugely important to understanding how cells work, because the cell membrane controls what comes in and goes out, the membranes of the body are important because of what they do, either what they make, what they secrete, or what they prevent or absorb. So all of these membranes are a combination of epithelium, that's going to be on the surface of them, and then connective tissue, which is going to give them their strength and their durability. So the 4 kinds of membranes, mucous membranes are membranes that secrete mucus. What is mucus? Well, it's a fluid, it's a slippery fluid that covers much epithelium in the body. So, classic example, the inside of your mouth is a mucous membrane. That isn't skin there. It's a mucous membrane. It's cells that secrete mucus. We find mucous membranes in the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, the urinary tract, and the reproductive tracts. So basically, anywhere there's a tube, the wall of that tube is going to be covered in mucous membrane. And we'll learn more about the functions of mucous membranes as we get to those different chapters. But mucus keeps things moist. And it also traps debris. Stuff that doesn't belong gets trapped in the mucus, and then the mucus gets moved, and that stuff that doesn't belong gets moved with it. All right, serous membranes line sealed cavities in the body. We're going to encounter a few of these. So the pleural space is where the lungs are. The abdominal cavity is where the digestive organs are. And then the pericardial cavity surrounds the heart. So in all of these membranes are very thin. They secrete a small amount of lubricating fluid to allow whatever's in that cavity to very easily move around. Like in your abdominal cavity, your small and large intestine move as they do their thing. So does the stomach. So this slippery fluid allows things to move next to each other very easily. The cutaneous membrane is what we're going to talk about in the next chapter. That's the skin. So it's not actually waterproof, but it's tough, it's water resistant, it's very durable, and it tends to be dry, but we'll learn more about that next time. And then the last kind of membrane is the synovial membrane. We find these on the inside of joints. So anytime 2 bones come together, that's a joint. And if those bones can move separate from one another, in other words, they can move against each other, that's a synovial joint. And inside that joint, there's a membrane that creates a slippery fluid that allows those bones to slide against each other without doing any harm. So again, we'll learn about these when we get to our articulation chapter, where we'll learn all about the joints. All right. So just examples, mucous membranes, we find lining tubes, serous membranes, cavities of the body, like the abdominal cavity here. The cutaneous membrane is the skin, and then the synovial membrane, which isn't pictured, we find at the joints. Okay. So all told, most of the body's weight is connective tissue and muscle tissue. So they are the 2 single largest by mass anyway. And then we have much smaller amounts of epithelial tissue and neural tissue. Now, what's interesting is these smaller, in weight, this is what we spend most of our time talking about, is we talk about epithelium, we talk about neural tissue, because both of those things are critical to how the body actually works. But in terms of mass, we're mostly connective tissue and muscle tissue. All right. So there's 3 kinds of muscle tissue. There's skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And all 3 of them share some things in common, but they differ in important ways. And eventually, after we get through our muscle tissue chapter, you're going to need to be able to discriminate between these 3. So it's smart to start picking up on some of the differences now. All right. So one of the characteristics of muscle is whether it is striated or not. So what striation is bands of light and dark. So if you look up here, as we go from one side to the other, we have a dark band and then a light band, and then a dark band and a light band. So here. Now, you could imagine if you looked at this, if you were to run your finger along the top of that, it might feel bumpy, right? Well, that's what they mean by striated, by that bumpy appearance. 2 of the 3 types of muscle are striated. So skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are both striated. Smooth muscle is called smooth because it's not bumpy. In other words, it's not striated. So that's one characteristic of muscle. The 3 different types. Skeletal muscle is what moves the bones around. This is the muscle you think of. The biceps, the triceps, the pectoralis. Those are all skeletal muscles that move bones. Cardiac muscle doesn't move anything but itself and blood. So, the heart contracts, and it does so with skeletal muscle. And then smooth muscle is really the muscle of organs. So, like the digestive tract, the respiratory tract has smooth muscle. Smooth muscle contracts kind of slowly and relaxes kind of slowly. Unlike skeletal muscle that can contract real fast, smooth muscle can't do that. So it's all sort of slow. And instead of being arranged in fibers like these 2 are, smooth muscle is arranged in kind of sheets instead. So and we'll see examples of these in these other organ systems. All right. So some of the differences. Okay, so we've got skeletal muscle at the top, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. All right. So skeletal muscle is always parallel. The fibers are parallel to each other. So even if you zoomed out from this, what you would still see is parallel fibers. So you can see 1, 2, 3 parallel fibers. We see striations. So those 2 things. So parallel fibers, striations. Skeletal muscle has multiple nuclei per cell. This whole thing right here is all one cell, but we see a nucleus here and a nucleus here. Skeletal muscle is multinucleated, and it's because as muscle develops, multiple cells combine to form one muscle cell. All right, so striations, parallel fibers, multiple nuclei. In cardiac muscle, okay, we see striations here, but we see not parallel fibers, but branching fibers. So if you look at skeletal muscle, you'll never see a branching like this, where 2 come together, and here's one where there's a Y, where 1 splits apart. So cardiac muscle branches, and there's only 1 nucleus per cell. So if you see a muscle sample, and you see branching fibers and 1 nuclei per cell, you know that that's cardiac muscle, not skeletal. These are the 2 that get confused most easily, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Because smooth muscle looks very different than these others. I mean, I guess you could see some similarities between these 2. But smooth muscle is sort of arranged like this. There are no fibers. They're sort of diamond-shaped, the smooth muscle cells are, particularly when they're stretched out like this. When they contract, they get to be more circular in shape. But we're going to hit these differences again when we actually get to the muscle chapter later. All right. And then we're going to finish up this semester talking about the nervous system and nerve cells. So this is the mover and shaker here. This is the neuron. Neurons have dendrites where they receive information, and they have a very long axon where they transmit information. And then associated with neurons are the glial cells. These are non-neuron cells that help the neurons and nurture the neurons as they do their thing. All right, so we'll talk about all those later. All right, so we'll do a little quick question here. What type of tissue is this? All right, that's everybody. Very good. That is B. That's cardiac muscle. So how can you tell? Well, you see striations, right? You know, you can see this kind of bumpy pattern here, and then these fibers branch. You know, so branching fibers and striations, it has to be cardiac muscle. And then see here and here where there are these kind of break points. Those are called intercalated discs, and it's how cardiac muscle cells attach together. So that's another thing. If you spot these lines like this, you also know you're looking at cardiac muscle because the other two muscle types don't have those. All right, we're not going to go through these because I want to move on. Smooth muscle, see, no striation, and sort of that stratified appearance. And then skeletal muscles, see, they're parallel fibers. You don't see any branching here. You have easy to see striation. And then you have lots of nuclei for each cell. So classic characteristics of skeletal muscle. All right. So that's it for tissues. Now, really, we're going to pick up... Oh, I never turned the lights back on. Sorry, everybody. We're going to spend a lot of time in lab next week and the week after really looking at those tissue types, because an important part of any anatomy class is what we call histology. And histology is microscopic anatomy. So you need to be able to recognize the different tissue types, be able to, work your way around a slide to see the different parts of it. And we're going to work on that in lab this week. All right. So the integument. The integument is another name for skin. Technically, it is skin and hair is the integumentary system. So skin and what skin makes, because it is skin that makes hair. It's skin that makes sweat. So all of that whole system is called the integumentary system. Now, there is a boundary, though. At the lips, for example, are the boundary between the integumentary system and the respiratory and digestive system. So like the inside of your mouth is not technically skin. It's not part of the integumentary system. That's a mucous membrane instead. All right, so as just a sort of introduction, here is what skin looks like, zoomed in and looked underneath. So we have the topmost layer, what we can put our fingers on, is the keratin coat of the epidermis. So we divide the skin into layers. The epidermis is on top. It's an epithelium. And then the dermis lies underneath. So this is epidermis here, and then this whole thing here is all dermis. We divide the dermis into two sections. There's a papillary layer. Papilla just means hill. So this area where it's kind of hilly, that's the papillary layer. And then underneath it is the reticular layer. And we'll talk in more detail about all this stuff. This is just a little intro. And then underneath the dermis is a space called the hypodermis, or the hypodermal space. Now, technically, this hypodermal layer is not part of the skin. It's not part of the integumentary system. The integument is the epidermis and dermis. The hypodermis is a connective tissue layer, and this is where arteries, veins, and nerves all travel to and from the skin. This is also the hypodermal layer is a site of there's a fat layer there that helps to keep our body temperature in, and in different areas of the body that the size of that fat layer can vary significantly. You've probably heard the word hypodermal in terms of an injection. A hypodermic needle is a needle that puts something into the hypodermal space. So, if you were going to poke a needle through this and put something in here, you have put something into that hypodermal space. Some other structures we're going to talk about, here's a hair follicle right here. You can see that it goes way down deep into the dermis. The dermal layer has many different sensory receptors. The reason that we can feel that the sense of touch exists is primarily because of the dermal layer, is where all those receptors are. Here we got a sweat gland, part of the dermis that empties out onto the skin. We're going to see that we have 3 different kinds of sweat glands. There are these tiny little muscles that attach to hair in the skin. These are called the erector pili muscles. They're what responsible for goosebumps. So the reason that your hairs can all stand up on end is because they have a little tiny muscle attached that pulls on them and makes them stand up. No one is really sure why we have that. In furry animals, one of the theories is that when an animal is afraid or is trying to be threatening to another animal, they puff up. Like you've seen a cat or dog, they puff up. These are probably our puffing up muscles, but we don't have that much hair anymore, so it doesn't really do much except give us little bumps on the skin. Let's see. What else can we point out here? Nerve fibers, sweat glands. So we're going to talk about all of these as we go through here. For each and every chapter now, from this point on, there'll be a slide like this, and that is about the functions of whatever organ system we're looking at. Because the body is never just doing one thing. Even though our organs have a primary function, all of the organs of the body have secondary functions too. Other things they do that are part of homeostasis that are not, their primary function. So what's the primary function of the skin? Well, that's this first one, protection. We want to protect the delicate underlying tissues and organs against impact, abrasion, fluid loss, chemical attack, infection, all of those things. So the skin is first and foremost a tough barrier to the outside world. But in addition to that, the skin does a bunch of other things too. So there are glands that are part of the skin system, the sweat glands, the 3 different kinds. And they are responsible for excretion of salts, water, and even organic wastes. So there are some things that our body can get rid of by putting them in the sweat. It goes out onto the skin, and then it evaporates out into the atmosphere. So, and we all know that sweat contains sodium chloride, so it's another way that we can balance our salt is by putting it out on the skin. The skin is hugely important in the maintenance of normal body temperature. It's our radiator, so to speak. As warm-blooded creatures, we create more heat than we need to maintain our temperature. So except when it's like it is outside now, we're always trying to get rid of excess heat. And it is the skin that participates in that. So when our body temperature starts to rise, more blood is shunted through the skin, so it works just like the radiator in your car. That warm blood coming next to the air that's all around us, and that heat leaves, that heat escapes into the air. The skin also has an evaporative cooling system. So just like a swamp cooler, sweat works the same way. When water evaporates, it cools whatever it evaporated from, it cools it down. So we put a small amount of water on our skin when we're hot, that water evaporates and it takes heat away with it. So maintenance of normal body temperature. All right. We live, under a star, and that star has ultraviolet radiation, which can damage DNA. UV light damages DNA and can cause problems with cell division. So the body has a built-in sun screening mechanism, and that's melanin. And we're going to talk about melanin next time. It's a pigment that absorbs UV radiation. Once it's absorbed, then it can't do any damage to DNA somewhere else. So melanin amounts vary from person to person and are a primary component of what makes up skin color. But we'll talk about melanin later. The skin produces keratin. Keratin is a tough, water-resistant protein. It is primarily responsible for giving skin its protective characteristics. So it produces a kind of flexible shell over the top of us. The skin is responsible for producing a vitamin that we need, and that's vitamin D3. This is a vitamin that is critical to normal calcium metabolism. So keeping our bones good and strong, we need vitamin D. And it's a fascinating system because that very same UV that we have melanin to help us fight against is used to create vitamin D. So we can make vitamin D, but only if we get enough UV sun exposures, enough sun exposure. And you'll talk more about vitamin D when we get to the endocrine chapter. The skin stores lipids. Lipids are energy storage molecule. Fat is stored in that area just underneath the skin. And then finally, the skin is the single largest sense organ that the body has. So all areas of skin have touch receptors of multiple different types. There's also pressure receptors, pain receptors, temperature receptors. So lots of information about the outside world is brought into the central nervous system from the skin as the single largest sense organ. All right. So we're going to sort of start at the top and work our way down. The epidermal layer is the topmost layer of skin. So when we look at our skin, what we're seeing is the top of the epidermis. The epidermis is tough, flexible, water-resistant. Underneath the dermis is the dermis. It's rubbery and dense and elastic. So the epidermis gives us the toughness, and then the dermis underneath gives us the elasticity. Skin is very flexible, at least young skin is, and it's rubbery. So when we hit something, some of that force is diverted by its rubberiness. So one thing that's very important with two layers of a thing is we have to keep the layers from separating. The last thing we want is that dermal layer to peel off or the epidermal layer to peel off the dermal layer. They need to be held closely together, which is where the hills come in. So the reason that we have that the dermis is hilly on top, it has these papillae, and then the epidermis has ridges that fit down into the valleys, so we have sort of peaks and valleys that match each other, is it prevents the epidermis and dermis from sliding on one another. Because one of the forces that our skin endures is what we call tangential or rubbing. Like when you go to rub your skin, if it wasn't for these ridges, the epidermis would have a tendency to slide on the dermis, and we want to keep those two locked together. So this hill and valley system evolved because it makes it almost impossible for that epidermis to slide on that dermis because of the three-dimensional structure here. So it basically locks the dermis and epidermis together so they can't be sheared apart. All right. So the epidermis is it's a stratified squamous epithelium. That means that it's made up of layers. And the cells that make up the epidermis are called keratinocytes. So they're not called skin cells anymore. Now they're called keratinocytes. And we call them keratinocytes because they produce keratin. Keratin is a tough, water-resistant protein. And it's that keratin that becomes the surface of the skin, as we'll see here in a minute. There are two kinds of skin on the body. One is very prevalent, and one is only found in a couple of places. Thick skin is found only on the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. Now, if you imagine, evolutionarily, our ancient ancestors walked on all fours, right? So we had 4 feet. So in the palmar and sole regions, we have thick skin, and it is much more abrasion resistant than the rest of our skin is. So just like your dog and cat has pads on their paws, well, that's thick skin too. It's the same thing. So walking skin is thick skin. It has 5 layers. Thin skin, which is the skin everywhere else on the body, has only 4 layers. So the thicker one has 1 extra layer. And what you'll see is the real difference between thick and thin is not so much this 1 layer, it's the amount of keratin layers that sit on top of it, as we'll see later. Okay. So, let me just off so we can see our picture. Okay. So, this looking under the microscope. Okay, so here's the epidermal layer right here. See, there's a dermal papilla right here, or a hill. Underneath here, this is the dermis, and then all of this up here, this is all dead cells that are full of keratin. So this is the keratinization. But what we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes is the layers of this epidermal region. Okay, so we're going to zoom in and look at that. So the epidermis is here, dermis down here, and So this is the living part of the epidermis. So it this is the boundary right here. And all of this stuff up here is dead. So the layers that we're going to talk about are really between the dermis here and where the keratin starts here. Okay, so the innermost layer, which is down here, so right on top of the dermis, is what we call the stratum basale. So that's how you say that, basale. It's a single layer of cells. So most of the cells there are keratinocytes, but you also see some melanocytes distributed in this area too. A melanocyte makes melanin. So if a keratinocyte makes keratin, a melanocyte makes melanin. And what we'll see is that the melanin that the skin cells or the keratinocytes end up containing is produced by the melanocyte and then sort of injected into the other cells. But more on that later. Okay. The important part of the stratum basale, so this layer down here, is this is where cell division occurs. So, we all know that our skin cells are constantly dividing. We're shedding dead skin cells and we're making new skin cells all the time. Well, that division occurs at the stratum basale. So at that first layer just above the dermis, that's where keratinocytes are born, so to speak. It takes about 7 days to go from the stratum basale all the way up to the stratum corneum, which is where the cells die. So that's a pretty fast turnover. Cells are huge numbers of cells are being produced in the skin all the time. All right. So then the next layer up, and the largest layer of living cells, when you look at this picture, well, obviously, whatever this is the largest layer. But the living cell layer is down here, and the largest layer of that is called the Stratum Spinosum. And it's called spinosum, that means spiny. And there's a sort of a little story about that. It's called that because when you look at that region under the microscope, if we were to zoom in on that, which obviously I can't do on the PowerPoint, but you would see that the cells have little spines that stick out. Now, they're not like that when the cell is alive. It's an artifact. In other words, when the tissue is processed so we can look at it under the microscope, those cells shrink a little bit and it gives them their sort of spiny appearance. So the stratum spinosum sits above the stratum basale here, and it's the largest layer of, so it's stratified. We have lots of different layers. In addition to the keratinocytes, in this layer we also have Langerhans cells, which are now called dendritic cells. There's a movement in anatomy to get rid of people's names out of the descriptions of things. So a lot of times there's two names for stuff. So like the Langerhans cells are now called the dendritic cells. These are immune system cells that are capable of destroying bacteria, are capable of beginning an immune system response. And it kind of makes sense to have some immune cells here, because if a bacteria up here is trying to get down into the body and cause an infection, well, it's going to have to pass through that stratum spinosum layer. So it makes sense to have some cops or some soldiers here to keep intruders from coming through, and those are the dendritic cells. All right. So that's the stratum spinosum. The stratum granulosum, which is right here, and the pictures in your book are way better than mine on these things, but the stratum granulosum, it gets its name. Granulosum just means grainy. And again, under the microscope, inside of these cells, you see little grains of stuff. And what those grains are a lipid that is formed inside the keratinocytes that helps to keep the skin waterproof and soft and supple. So that's the grainy layer, stratum granulosum. And then in this, this is thick skin here. You can see that there's kind of this clear line right there. See, there's a good spot to see it. And here's another, and here's another, and here's another. That's the stratum lucidum. Lucidum just means clear. And this is the layer that's different between thick skin and thin skin. Thick skin has a stratum lucidum. Thin skin does not. So when you look at thin skin, you don't see this thin, empty layer there at all. The only thing left in the stratum lucidum, those cells are alive, but all that's left there is keratin. Essentially, once the keratinocyte is born, it manufactures keratin, more and more and more of it, and it gets moved up here, and then it dies, and that keratin that it made while it was alive is what becomes that outermost covering, or that keratin coat that makes us kind of a flexible shell. All right. So the last layer is the dead layer. This is the stratum corneum. So this is 10 to 30 layers of now dead keratinocytes with all their keratin has been left behind. So it's the stratum corneum that we feel when we touch our skin, at least if there's not an injury. It's water resistant but not waterproof. So we always are losing some water through our skin, but it's pretty waterproof. I mean, it keeps our fluid in very successfully. You can see that it's not entirely waterproof. When you've been swimming for a long time, your skin gets all puckery, and that's because water has flowed in by osmosis into the skin and made the skin boggy or heavier. And then in salt water, you get just the opposite. When you swim in the ocean, you get out, you feel like you're all dry and pruny, and that's because the salt water has pulled water out of your skin. But the stratum corneum is that flexible shell made up of keratin that was formed by the keratinocytes while they were alive. All right, so let's stop there, and we will pick up next time talking about the dermis.